everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 96 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight, folks, is going to be a marvelous debrief. Simply marvelous. We're going to talk about voluntary muscle contractions. Are these a useful thing to utilize in the rehabilitation and training or just improving your movement skills arena? Stay tuned. We're going to talk about building fitness during rehab. Can you still get some gains when you end them chronic pains? Stay tuned. And last but not least, we're going to talk about hip pain during the squats. So you're squatting, you begin a little bit of hip pain, and you got some issues going on with your bench. What's up with that? I'm going to tell you what's up with that tonight, folks, because these have been questions that have been asked by the people. They'll be answered for the people by this people right here, Fam Recognized Fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from Andy. And here's what Andy has to say. I've heard you talk about the Chipotle squeeze. Do you find any benefit from intentionally engaging muscles assigned to feed forward / anticipatory activation prior to and or during therapeutic or fitness exercise? Great question, Andy. So I don't personally do that. That's not really my thing of like squeeze this, squeeze that. That could potentially be useful to improve some degree of body awareness or maybe as a meditative practice, but for either improving someone's movement capabilities or just as a general warm-up to fitness or as helping movement patterns, I don't necessarily see that as quite useful, with the caveat that I will occasionally use the Chipotle squeeze. So let me unpack that a little bit. Why I don't think just contracting stuff is going to be worthwhile. First off, you don't necessarily know what orientation your body is in when you are starting a particular contraction. For example, say you're just, chilling like Bob Dylan and you're doing some glute squeezes. I'm doing some right now. What do you think about that? If I'm someone who, let's say, has a loss of movement options in the pelvic region and I'm in a more anteriorly oriented orientation, if I contract my glutes in this position, instead of creating a posterior tilt or straight up hip extension, what may actually happen instead is I'm going to create some degree of external rotation from this anteriorly oriented state. Instead of that engaging the posterior tilt, that just may translate the pelvis forward, which is probably not a desirable thing to happen for most exercises. If you're going to squat, as we'll talk a little bit about later, you want to go straight up and down, not necessarily forward. Then you have a mismatch where your pelvis is forward and your thorax is back, and that's probably going to impact performance or movement in a way that's not desirable. So you don't necessarily know what orientation you're in when you're just doing general contractions. What I find to be much more beneficial is utilizing movement of the body to elicit the contractions that we're desiring. It's much better for me to do something like a wall bridge, which I'll link in the show notes if you don't know what that is. It's a really good activity. But I would rather get someone to feel their glute max that way, where they're placing their body in an orientation that is desirable, because then I'm going to be having glute max acting more as a posterior tilter and hip extender than I am going to be driving external rotation and subsequent pelvic translation forward. Now, the one time that I do utilize voluntary muscle contractions is with the Chipotle squeeze. I talked about this a little bit on debrief. I'll link it in the show notes and the pelvic floor debrief. But basically, what the Chipotle squeeze is acting like you're holding in gas. What that serves to do is your external anal sphincter, which I'll show you on this video. I bet the podcasters are going to love that one. But the external anal sphincter attaches to the coccyx, and it's in the center of the pelvic floor. And so if I contract this muscle, it's going to pull the coccyx towards the center of the pelvic floor, which is going to create sacral counternutation. That's useful for activities like squatting, but also if you have someone whose pelvis is anteriorly oriented, which you would check by a loss of hip extension. But if I have someone who's anteriorly oriented, that can be a useful way to help create the posterior orientation of the pelvis, because there's not really any other option that the pelvic floor is, or the posterior pelvic floor is going to allow for. Like with the glute max, you could have translating the pelvis forward, posterior tilt, or hip extension. The external anal sphincter is really only going to close the sphincter, and subsequently that involves getting posterior tilt of the sacrum or sacral counternutation. And in situations like that, perhaps a voluntary muscle contraction is useful. But I usually will only do that after someone has the ability to get the posterior tilt or the stacking of the pelvis underneath the thorax. And then you add a little Chipotle squeeze, and that's some icing on the pelvic cake. So to summarize your great question, I don't necessarily utilize voluntary muscle contractions because you don't know what the starting orientation is. Could be useful from a meditative practice just because you're finding and feeling certain areas, but from a movement prep standpoint, not really my thing. You don't know where their body is oriented in, thus you don't know what the action is going to be on the body. What I find much more useful is using movement to create the muscle contractions. And if you've done that, then the one time that I will do something is the squeezing of the pelvic floor to elicit sacral counternutation. And that's my stance on that. Andy, great question. If you're wondering, well, Zach, what are some good activities to teach posterior tilting? Well, you could definitely scour my website and find in many of those, especially my YouTube channel on Zach Couples. But I got a better option for you. The option is Human Matrix, because there we'll not only teach you how to improve someone's movement capabilities, but we'll teach you how to move with efficient and good technique under load, squats, deads, push-pull, all types of wild and crazy stuff. And the reason why I'm announcing this so early is because I added another one to the list. Folks, here's what we got. October 5th and 6th in Boston, Massachusetts, right around the corner. You probably want to sign up for that. November 23rd and 24th in New York City. December 7th and 8th in Orlando, Florida. January 25th, 26th in Scotts Valley, California. And April 4th and 5th, 2020 in Atlanta, Georgia. And yes, the players will play at that one. I hope to see you there. The next question comes from Lucy. And here's what Lucy asks. Hey, Zach. That's how she talks. How would you explain to a client that adding fitness and strength should be part of their rehab journey? Fam recognize fam. And yes, she did say that. Lucy, great question, which, by the way, check out the blog. I did a review of her course, A Consistent Approach. And it's a good course. You should check it out. Of course, I'm biased. But so why should fitness be in someone's rehabilitation journey? This is a great question. I think building fitness or maintaining fitness is useful both in acute and persistent pain instances. In the acute scenario, if you're trying to get back to a particular task, such as a sport, or you want to get back in the weight room, if you've hurt one area, you still likely have all the other areas on your body to maintain fitness. And if you can maintain fitness, it's going to be much easier to transition from recovering from the acute injury back to performing at a high level. So you most certainly should do that for that reason alone. But what about someone in persistent pain? Someone who maybe movement and exercise hurts, and you're trying to slowly introduce some of the fitness-based activities that we might do in the rehabilitation arena. Why is it useful for these people? That's a great question. There's quite a bit of research out there, and I will link this systematic review that I read recently where, let's see, systematic review on pain. On the hypoalgesic effects of exercise, I think is what it was called. So, does exercise help reduce pain? And they looked at both populations who have acute pain and persistent pain. Guess what? In acute pain, exercise, both isometric, concentric, eccentric, and aerobic exercise, have all been shown to help reduce the pain that someone's experiencing. And in, I believe it was isometrics and aerobic exercise, also was shown to help most people in persistent pain. I say most because the populations that were studied that had shown to be beneficial were people who had, I believe it was chronic shoulder pain and chronic low back pain. The one where it's a little bit of a would actually be your fibromyalgia, surprisingly, at least in this systematic review. Now, there's other reviews out there or studies, and I'll see if I can snag these as well, that show aerobic exercises being one of the top modalities that you could employ for someone who has something such as fibromyalgia or more widespread pain. The thing that's really tough with these studies, though, is you can't just, when you're working with someone in pain, apply these interventions willy-nilly. Much like when you're educating someone about pain, you have to meet them where they're at, story-wise. You have to do the same thing with where their fitness is. So applying 30 minutes of aerobic exercise across the board in a population of persistent pain may be unreasonable for many of them. And thus, you'll have some people who don't get better. And it's not because exercise isn't useful, it's because you program too much too soon. Just like if you're going to be doing a study on deadlifting and you have a large population that includes beginners, intermediates, and experts, you're probably not going to start everyone at 500 pounds. Same principle applies for someone in persistent pain. You have to meet them where they're at. And that could be as simple as, hey, you got to start getting on a walking program. But it's useful for helping from a pain perspective, one, but two, many times what can happen is if you have been in persistent pain and you're not moving for an extended period of time, the tissues get deconditioned. When that happens, and then you have a situation where you have to go and perform some type of physical activity, your tissues might not be ready for that. And then you might not get hurt necessarily, but what could happen is you get a flare-up in symptoms because, whoa, I'm doing this activity that's beyond my normal capabilities. Brain perceives this as a threat. You got to slow the F down. I'm going to increase pain, so you do so. And then you got problems. So why using or building fitness while you're in the rehab process is useful is because it will allow you to condition your tissues. So then when you have to go do that task, you're less likely to have a flare-up. So it's a twofold thing when you're talking exercise and in the rehab process. One is going to help with pain because the research shows that exercise can help with pain. Two is going to condition your tissues so you're able to do a wider variety of tasks without running the risk of a flare-up. And lastly, if you are an individual who has acute pain, you've sustained an injury, maintaining your fitness levels or even attempting to build your fitness levels while you're in rehab will make the transition from injury to performance that much better. Lucy, great question. The last question comes from Sean. Here's what Sean asked me. Hey, Zach, I have a deep hip IR pain, so pain with internal rotation. Possible psoas tendonitis. Sure. When squatting, so I get deep hip IR pain or internal rotator hip pain when squatting, and it seems to correlate when I have an increase in arched bench press frequency. What gives? Well, Sean, I'll give you the answer to what I think gives. Now, while I don't know of any research showing increasing bench press correlating with increase in hip pain, I have a potential link between those two. When you're arching, in a bench. And the reason why you would do that, and that's useful, is because it shortens the bar path. But when you arch, your pelvis has to go into an anterior orientation. Now, in some studies, if you look at the literature on hip impingement, they did a three-dimensional model, and I'll link that in the show notes, of course, which will be on zachcouples.com. But they did a three-dimensional model where they showed that if you anteriorly tilt the pelvis, now I don't know how they define that, but if you anteriorly tilt the pelvis, that leads to a loss of hip internal rotation. I need the ability to rotate when I go down into a squat. And if I, for some reason, maybe have been increasing my arch bench press, that could potentially create a loss of rotation in the hips. Then I don't have access to that motion when I go into a squat. So then what happens is you run out of range of motion, you hit your end range sooner, and that could potentially lead to some hip pain. That would be my guess in terms of why you have that going on. Without seeing you, obviously I'd want to perform an assessment. But if that's what you got going on, what you may want to do is, well, I don't think you necessarily have to give up arched bench presses, especially if you're training for powerlifting. That's actually a useful way to perform the bench because it reduces the bar path. And when you're powerlifting, it's all about making you as efficient as possible to move as much weight as possible. But what you may consider doing is you might need to do some stuff to offset the arched position that you're going into. And in fact, I don't know if you're doing this on your squat, but if you're arching on your squat, that's probably not a worthwhile way to squat. I will link this study in the show notes on squatting, but they did a study. This was in trained people, fitness pros to be exact, which, Sean, I don't know if you're a fitness pro or not, but people who were fit pros, they did the back squat, and as soon as the bar was put on the back with 50% of body weight, that individual's spine went into kyphosis. If you are arching your back, you are taking it out of the normal position, the lower back, out of the normal position that likely occurs when you're doing a squat. So what I would rather encourage is a slight tuck if you can do that. Obviously that will be less with a back squat just due to the position of the bar. But if you do a slight tuck and then you would do normal things that would improve the intra-abdominal pressure, so making sure you get a deep breath that's multi-directional, brace, go up and down, you're probably going to feel a lot better on your squat. But what I would also do simultaneously is activities that go the opposite direction. This would be some of the exercises we talked about before, like that wall bridge that I discussed, if you can do that, or some of the squatting activities that I have in on my YouTube channel. Rolling, I've been a huge nut on doing different rolling back and forth to create the posterior orientation. I'll link some of my favorite rolls in the notes. Not sushi rolls, but you get the point. Drunken turtle. But that's what I would do. That's probably what I think you got going on. So to summarize, Sean, what's the deal? You got deep pain in your hip because your squats, you've been arching a lot. You probably have reduced range of motion from the activity that you're doing that's available in your hips, potentially hip internal rotation. You need to not necessarily modify your bench and your back squat if you're training for powerlifting, but you might need to do some things to counteract that. I would make sure that you're doing things that take you into the opposite direction, whether it's a wall bridge, rolling, anything I got on my website is pretty much focused on that. So do that. Make sure you're not excessively arching on your back squat. And I think if you do those things alone, you're probably going to get your hip feeling better, and you ought to be in business. When in doubt, go tuck yourself. I think that's a good stopping point for us tonight. Yeah, multidimensional. Thank you, beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. If you want to learn more, I would go to zachcouples.com, subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get 5 hours of talks on that. You're going to get a free acute to chronic workload calculator. You'll get weekend goodies every Friday. You'll get access to exclusive deals because you're the fam. While you're there, you'll also want to check out the services I have to offer. If maybe this is you, you're getting some pain with squatting, or your squat just doesn't feel good, or you got loss of performance, you might want a pro to look at it. And what we can do is we'll do a movement consultation. I will perform an assessment on you, will improve your movement capabilities, or I'll perform an assessment on one of your clients and improve their movement capabilities. I have quite a few pros who do that. And if we do those things, you might notice that your squat feels mo better. Or maybe you just want to skip that and say, Zach, you know what, I'm done with this squat pain. I want you to program me a fitness program so I can feel good and look good. Well, I got an answer for that. It's online training. We can take that same movement consultation information and we can design a fitness program that's specifically tailored to your needs based on your movement capabilities. Or perhaps you just want to learn how to do that with your peeps. Well, the answer for that is mentoring. What we can do is I will take my brain and see if I can consult with you and help your clientele, because I get it. Some of the stuff I talk about, you're wondering, well, how does this fit with my people? We will sift through that together as a team and take your movement and your fitness capabilities of you and your clients to the next level. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com, I want you to also check me out on iTunes and Stitcher at The Zach Couples Show, because guess what, folks? There's 95 other debriefs. If you really want to look at me for all of them, take me on a nice car ride somewhere, preferably along the beach, maybe on the California one or the coast on Florida, whatever you want to do. But go there, leave a review so we can help the fam grow. On social media, I'm on Facebook /ZCouples. The Twitter handle is @ZCouples. I'm on that Instagram, baby. Zach, ZAC Couples, CUPPLES. And also, as I've been alluding to, YouTube. Search Zach Couples. You'll find me there. You get a gang of exercises, get the most up-to-date stuff that I'm using. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a wonderful audience. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.